All right, so good morning. Once again, my name is Ashley Edwards, and I am an extension agent in Southwest Virginia. This is going to be the third meeting in a series on small scale vegetable production. Today, we're going to be talking about integrated pest management, which is kind of a holistic approach to pest management, really popular with organic growing systems just because of its ability to really foster a healthy ecosystem on your farm. So I'm going to try to cover a lot here in kind of a short amount of time. So if you do have any questions as we go along, please feel free to type them up in the chat box, and we'll take some time at the end to address those. And we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so what we're going to be talking a little bit about today is, of course, what exactly is integrated pest management. And then I want to go a little bit more detailed and talk about some very specific management practices to control weeds, insect pests, and some crop diseases like as a whole. And then very briefly, I do want to mention, and maybe we can share some thoughts on controlling vertebrate pests as well, since that seems to be a really big issue, particularly where I am with deer. So we can kind of gauge how that is across the state. So first off, what exactly is integrated pest management? Well, IPM for short is just an ecosystem-based strategy for managing pests that really focuses on long-term prevention. We're looking at how do we control pests in a way that really fosters a healthy ecosystem as a whole. So some of the practices that we're going to use really take into consideration the specific crop. We have to understand what pest it is that we are trying to control. And then we're looking to implement the least disruptive control tactics as possible. So that might include using chemicals, but only as a last resort. So this chart shows the order in which IPM tactics are performed. And it is, like I said, really important to note that the goal of IPM is often not to eliminate the pest problem as a whole, but it's more to reduce it to levels that are considered acceptable, ones that you can deal with. And this is to promote a more balanced ecosystem with all key players in part. This slide here can look a little confusing, but essentially we're talking about the economic injury level. That's what you see with that line that has the blue horizontal line. And this is basically where the benefit of pest control exceeds the cost of that control. You really are needing to pay attention to the economic threshold, which is like the action trigger. So this, at that level, the benefit of applying a control method might not exceed the cost that it would cost you to implement it. So in order to determine what the economic threshold is for your specific pest, it's important that you work with extension. One example that I will give here is I do a lot of work with orchards, and they have a lot of programs, or extension and researchers have a lot of programs out there that where they will do pest monitoring for the grower at different research stations across the state, determine what the economic threshold is, and then relay that information to you as the grower. Generally, the producer doesn't always know what those levels are unless they're, really doing a lot of pest monitoring and scouting, which we'll go into later. So feel free to use extension to help you as you try to determine what these levels are. So. All right, so a little on preparation. You need to be aware of the potential problems and opportunities in your fields. So when you decide what crop it is that you're going to grow, it's up to you to really understand what are the pests of that crop. What practices can you take to potentially avoid them from becoming an issue? How exactly do you scout for them? What are the tactics that are the best for that? What control tactics are out there? If despite your best efforts, you do have an issue with that pest and you have to do some sort of, take some sort of action. What beneficial species are there in your field that can help you out in dealing with these pest issues? And also, what are your strengths and limitations related to your operation? So how much labor do you have to devote to pest management? What equipment do you have, etc.? So as I mentioned before, prevention is really the key with IPM. Rather than always wanting to fix a problem, we want to hopefully have a system set up and to where we have less problems to begin with. So what are some practices that we can do that will contribute to crop protection for the long term? We're gonna talk about this a lot throughout this presentation, but this includes the use of biological controls. This includes crop rotation, using host plant resistance, sanitation on your crop and fields, site selection, healthy soil, healthy crops, and making sure that you have habitat for natural enemies of the pests. As you see here, when I mentioned site selection, I wanted to point out that this includes knowing your fields and what the history or the pest history in those fields are. So you would not want to plant a crop in an area that had a history of being infested with a pest that was economically injurious to that crop. And of course, as we mentioned in our last presentation, it's important that we rotate our crops and disrupt the pest's life cycles. If you have a field where you know you have a continual problem with a pest that attacks cucurbit crops, maybe don't put one there this year. And then you're breaking up that life cycle just to hopefully get rid of that problem as a persistent issue. So the very first line of defense is obviously a very healthy, vigorous crop. This can be achieved by making sure that we have really healthy, fertile soils, that you're planting locally adapted varieties, so you already have that leg up when they're going into the field, that we're using resistant varieties. So when you're selecting which plants you're going to plant, make sure that you are getting in touch with those seed companies and seeing if they have some sort of a breeding program that gives you a little bit of the disease package built into that seed already. That can be very important when it comes to making sure that you are minimizing your pest issues. Make sure you're using or planting at the optimum time, at the optimum spacing for that crop. You don't want to, any added stressors are just going to weaken its ability to fight off pests. And then also having optimum plant nutrition and irrigation. So many of these were mentioned at our last presentation on vegetable production practices. So be sure that if you missed that presentation that you're able to go back and listen to that, because Mr. Hessler's presentation really hit on how to make sure that a lot of these are taken care of. So pest management options. So if you actually are having to take an action, it is important that you're choosing one that's going to optimize cost and effect while minimizing adverse effects. And that's both for the environment and for human health. So with IPM, some of the large categories that we'll break down, of course, are cultural controls. An example of that would be crop rotation. So this is something that the way in which you do things on the farm is with cultural controls. Mechanical controls are as they sound. So that would be what kind of equipment can you go in there and utilize to help get rid of some of your pest problems. An example is using a cultivator for taking care of weeds. Biological controls use biological resources like the use of beneficials, parasitic wasps, for example. And then you have genetic controls, which would be, like I mentioned, using plants that have disease-resistant disease packages built in. And then chemical controls as kind of our last resort. And this would include herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides targeting weeds, insect pests, and diseases. So this diagram is really just to show you how it's a really integrated approach where you want to incorporate as many different control mechanisms as possible. Another reason why that is so important is really not only to have a healthy ecosystem in your farm, but really to prevent any one pest from becoming resistant to any of these control tactics. You often hear of pests becoming resistant to certain pesticides, but they can actually become resistant to any of these other controls as well if they're not used intermittently with each other. So it's important that we utilize as many as possible. So this chart is basically just showing that there are different phases to organic IPM, focusing on prevention in the first phase with our cultural practices that we're implementing, and then kind of moving through each phase ultimately to potentially using approved chemicals of biological or mineral origin, as well as the use of mating disruption, if that's something that's feasible on your farm at that point. And we're going to then go into each of these phases a little bit more and talk about some of the specific practices in each one. So first phase, we're going to be talking about cultural controls. Now, when we're talking about cultural controls, these are just practices that you put in place that reduce pest establishment, reproduction, dispersal, and survival. So you're setting up your farm to minimize the likelihood that pests can thrive. This is really the foundation of organic pest management. And it's basically all of these practices are implemented at the beginning in the initial stage of organic farm planning. So I mentioned before that you want to know what type of problems you could potentially face beforehand so that you can set up these controls to mitigate that. So on this slide, I have a couple of strategies for cultural practices, and then beside of them, I have just an example. So hopefully maybe drive home a little bit more of what I mean by each of these topics. So when I say that we want to make the crop unavailable to pests at a specific space or time, in order to do that, you might pay close attention to site selection, as I mentioned. So if you know that this particular field has had an issue with a specific pest or insect pest or disease, plant a crop that's not susceptible to that pest or disease. Crop isolation, so keeping a crop away or from pests that you know have that issue. Timing of planting, timing of harvest, paying attention to the pest's life cycle when you select what you're planting. I mentioned intercropping, trap cropping, and mulching, and I'll go into a little more detail in further slides on what I mean by each of those, but the less of one particular thing that you have, the less likely, I'm saying this backwards, the more that you have crop-wise in an area is going to mean that a pest is going to have more trouble finding their target. So I have a picture that will make this make more sense later. Reducing pest survival by enhancing natural enemies. So I mentioned here farmscaping, increasing crop ecosystem diversity. For instance, if you were to make sure that surrounding your fields, you had lots of wildflowers and native plants that were really healthy for these pollinators, you're going to bring them in, you're going to have more opportunities for these beneficial insects to thrive, thus they're able to take care of some of your problem pests for you. And then altering the crop's susceptibility to pests. This is what I meant when I was saying selecting plants that have resistance to certain diseases. There are even some that give off properties that make them less susceptible to different diseases, having healthy soil quality and soil fertility. So we did mention this in our last presentation, but conservation tillage and just taking care of that soil is really going to favor the soil's biota, having lots of healthy organisms and microbes in there that can favor a greater number of predatory arthropods like spiders and beetles, which will take care of a lot of your bad guys. So we really want to make the environment healthy for the good guys to keep them around. to do work for us. So host plant resistance, this can really go a long way when we're talking about disease control. So the use of resistant crop varieties should be used whenever it is appropriate. I have these three resistance types here that I've listed, and I'm going to go into what those mean. So antibiosis, this is when the plant's resistance causes a negative effect on that pest. I guess let's say pest, or let's say an insect pest here. It affects them in a negative way. Thus, if the insect was to try to eat that plant, it's going to kill it. One good example of this might be BT corn, which has the Bacillus thuringiensis, that soil bacterium in it already. So it's deterring caterpillars from eating that corn plant. The chemicals in that plant are either going to directly kill, slow the development of, or reduce its reproductive capacity. Antizoonosis occurs when a pest is less likely to find or feed on a resistant plant. So this can be a physical characteristic, such as the plant having really dense hairs or a waxy surface, or other chemical characteristics that are going to deter feeding from that pest or disease infection. And then tolerance occurs when a plant is able to continue to thrive despite being attacked. So it doesn't really decrease the likelihood of the pest attacking the plant, but it's more of the ability of that plant to withstand it. Host plant resistance, it's really a very economical control method. Generally, these seeds that have these disease packages built in are pretty readily available, can get you a long way in pest control before you really even have to do any other sort of control methods. And also lessening your pesticide usage. So the picture that you see here is a really good example, I think, of a tomato plant that did have the resistance built in versus one that did not for Fusarium wilt. Moving into the second phase, we have vegetative management. So how can we make the habitat less suitable for pests, but more attractive to those beneficials that are there to help us out? Some of the key terms that I alluded to a moment ago was just enhancing the habitat for these beneficials, farmscaping. And I have here the definition is designing a permanent or temporary habitat specifically for beneficial insects, spiders, and other helpful species. You'll see in the photos to the left about how you have lots of ground cover, lots of area for those animals to have cover, and the use of flowers and other plants that will help attract those pollinators to come in. With ecological engineering, we're talking about conservation biological control. We're going to talk a little bit more about intercropping or companion planting, and then what are trap crops and how can you use those to help manage pests as well. So plant diversification is, as it sounds, you are just providing food and shelter for natural enemies, favoring their favorable microclimates, giving them lots of food sources, and essentially enhancing the top-down action of natural enemies on pests. So some things and examples would be utilizing beetle banks, conservation strips, or flowering strips around your field, as you just saw, to help those beneficials. Now, intercropping is when two or more crops are grown simultaneously in the same field. This can also be called mixed cropping. And you are just concentrating an area of host plants, as you see in this picture. In this picture, you see the plants are more spread out. When you have one field with less diversity, if an insect pest comes in there, it's going to be very easy for them to find their target. As you see in this picture, if an insect pest were to come in, or even a disease they're not going to have as much and as easy as a time to find each other and mate, just because their host plants are more spread out. When you have other crops present, you're lessening the likelihood that diseases can spread amongst them, and your outbreaks are generally going to be less serious. When we are discussing trap cropping, you're essentially planting a crop that's attractive to an insect pest near your desired crop or your cash crop in order for them to go to that crop and leave your cash crop alone. This picture is discussing an extension trial that was done where they have actually planted mustard plants beside broccoli plants in order to lure the flea beetles away from the broccoli. There's some, that could potentially work really well for you. Of course, you also have, maybe if you didn't have a lot of problems to start with, you might bring in some more. But this can specifically help too with trap cropping, is if you were to lure all of the pests to your trap crop, you could then spray that trap crop, not spray your cash crop. And thus you're able to kind of wipe out that insect population while not having to spray your crop. So that's one option and one really good use for trap cropping. And then some of the key factors that you'll have to take into consideration, of course, the attractiveness of that trap crop plant and the size. So some examples of commonly used pairs are using blue Hubbard squash alongside of summer squash, or pumpkins around melons. Cherry peppers around bell peppers in order to control pepper maggot, and collards being planted around cabbage for diamondback moth. All right, so our third phase is the use of biological control agents. So these include predators, parasitoids like wasps, using microbial agents, and this really allows for rapid response to pest problems. And I did want to point out that most of the research on this is actually in greenhouse systems, but that kind of makes sense. It would be a lot harder to release beneficials and then really monitor what they're doing if you're out in an open field versus in an enclosed greenhouse system. You always have the risks of them flying away or leaving, or somewhere that you can't contain them to really monitor what they're doing. But that's why it's really important that we set up our farm in such a way to really encourage the natural beneficials that may already be there. And then our fourth phase, if it comes to it that you might need to use insecticides or mating disruption. In organic systems, your insecticides have to be of biological or mineral origin. And when I'm talking about the use of pheromones, these are just those, those chemicals that the plants or that the insects give off, mostly for them to find their mates. So when we use pheromones, we are disrupting their ability to find their mate, so they're no longer able to reproduce. There's also repellent chemicals that you can use, mineral oils, insecticidal soaps, and then insecticides of non-synthetic origin, some of which actually still are allowed in organic production. So a little bit on the use of chemicals in IPM programs. The use of conventional pesticides in an IPM program may differ from that of a traditional chemical program. Reason being is chemicals, yes, are still allowed in an IPM program, but the attempt should be that they are the last resort. You're wanting to select chemicals and use them only as one of many actions. Think back to that graph that I showed you earlier, where they're all working together. You want those chemicals to be as specific to your target pest as possible. The use of broad spectrum pesticides can be really negative for those beneficial insects that we were talking about really wanting to take care of. You want to use them at the lowest effective rate. You want to select something that is more short-lived in the environment, the least toxic to beneficials and humans, and then, as I mentioned, alternated with other chemicals to help prevent resistance. And you never want to spray the same thing over and over and over again, and regardless of what chemical it is. So a little bit on the difference between organic and conventional or synthetic pesticides. An organic pesticide is generally derived from a naturally occurring source, such as minerals, plants, or animals. A synthetic pesticide is a substance that is formulated or manufactured by a chemical process or by a process that chemically changes the substance extracted from a naturally occurring plant, animal, or mineral source. Some examples of organic pesticides can include diatomaceous earth, neem oil, or even pyrethrins. Pyrethrins are used a lot even in conventional agriculture. And these is a pest control product that is an extract of a chrysanthemum flower. Some synthetically produced pesticides actually do meet the criteria for organic agriculture. Some examples include copper sulfate, peracetic acid, which is often used for disease control. One of the trade names of that one might be oxidate. Some mineral pesticides can include sulfur, copper, diatomaceous earth, clay-based materials. Your botanical materials can include rotenone, neem oil, pyrethrins. There are insecticidal soaps. One thing to note, though, detergent-based products are not allowed in organic production. With any extension meeting that talks about pesticide use, you are going to hear this preached always, is anytime, read that label, read the label, read the label. The label is the law, regardless of whatever the product is that you're using. And it's important to note that whether or not a pesticide is organic or synthetic, it can still be dangerous. The signal words are going to be on that label and are going to tell you the level of hazard that is there with that product. So read that label, determine the hazards, and choose the pesticide that is going to best meet your needs regarding pest control while also having the least amount of risk. With the signal words that you'll see here, we'll start with danger. That's the most toxic. Sometimes on these chemicals, you're going to see the poison word with the skull and crossbone image on the label. Sometimes you'll see the warning label. That means that the product is moderately toxic, and then caution, which is slightly toxic or non-toxic. But always read the label and follow the appropriate PPE requirements that you'll see on there. So what are some advantages and disadvantages to using organic pesticides? Well, some advantages are that they can be less persistent. So the residual is going to go away after a short time. And they can also be a little more selective. So I have here BT as an example. That is the soil bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis, which targets more of the caterpillars. So it's very specific. It's not going to affect other insects that aren't caterpillars. But on the same hand, you have disadvantages that are almost flip-flopped of that. So being less persistent can actually be a disadvantage as well. Because of that, when you spray, you're going to probably have to spray those products more frequently. And oftentimes there's a misconception about spraying organic pesticides. Sometimes they're actually being sprayed more often because of that short residual period. So you're having to use more product ultimately. Another disadvantage can be how selective these products are. So it might not be as helpful if you have multiple insect present or disease. Even if you have multiple species present, you're going to have to spray more chemicals to target each specific one rather than a broad spectrum. And then they are more finicky as far as requiring really proper timing and special handling. I had an example here using neem oil. So it can be used to stop some immature insects from feeding, but it might have very little effect on the adults of that species. So sometimes the advantages and the disadvantages are just flip-flopped, and you have to weigh what's the best for your operation. On the opposite note, we have synthetic pesticides. So what are some advantages and disadvantages here? Well, some advantages are that these products are generally less expensive. They can be more persistent. So you have longer protection after spraying with less product applied, thus saving you time and money. They are very readily available, generally having a longer shelf life. And then some of these chemicals are more broad spectrum. So on the opposite, we have the disadvantages column here, where you might run into some environmental concerns or harvest restrictions based on whatever the chemical is that you're applying. I did want to point out here, though, that when the label directions are followed, food that's grown with synthetic pesticides do not contain harmful residues. These products all go through very extensive research before they're put onto market to make sure that they are going to be safe, safe as long as the label is followed correctly. So that's on you, and that label is the law, as I mentioned. Additionally, the broad spectrum, while it can be an advantage, can also be a disadvantage in certain instances, leading to secondary explosions. I know here I have mentioned pyrethroids and aphids. So pyrethroids are generally cheap, readily available, a really good option for pest control on a lot of crops, but you have to pay attention to the fact that because they're broad spectrum, you can essentially kill off a lot of your beneficials as well as your target pest. So when you do that, you might see a secondary explosion of aphids. When we do a lot of our pumpkin programming, that's something we really hit on, is that the use of pyrethroids can flare secondary aphid outbreak. So timing and the use of other chemicals as well is really important here. So a little bit on pheromones. I mentioned these earlier, and that they can be used as a means to confuse or disrupt pests during their mating cycles. We also will use these traps to not just confuse mating cycles, but also to scout and monitor how much of an insect we might have present at a field. I'm currently part of a project where we're looking at brown marmorated stink bugs, and you're putting out pheromone traps in order to count how many of these stink bugs we have, and like how much pressure there is, in order to know what we need to do as far as control methods. This picture is basically using the same thing. This is a trap, but monitoring corn earworm in sweet corn fields. So let's say you're wanting to do organic crop production and you're wanting to know what type of chemicals are there for you to use. The national list, and that is what it's called, is part of the National Organic Program. And this list is going to tell you what synthetic materials are allowed in organic crop production. And it also contains natural or non-synthetic materials that are prohibited. So some people might think just because it is not synthetic or a natural product that it is safe and good for use in organic, and that is not true. That's why you need to look at this list to make sure that you are using approved substances in your program. I did want to point out, and anyone who's pretty familiar with organic growing practices is probably aware of the Organic Materials Review Institute, or OMRI. They evaluate products for their suitability in organic production. Generally, most certifiers are going to respect what the OMRI says is OMRI listed, and their decisions are highly respected. So when you are shopping for a pest control chemical, when you see the OMRI label, it's most often a really good sign that that is a product that is safe for use in organic production. You do want to run all your chemicals by your certifier as part of your organic systems plan, though, and making sure that everything checks out with them before you use it. So now we're going on to specific management practices to control insects, diseases, and weeds. So managing insect pests. First thing first, you have to know what pest it is that you're trying to manage. You use extension to help you if you don't know how to identify the bad guys that are out there. But you need to know their mode of dispersal. You need to understand their life cycle so that you know at what stage your control is going to be the most effective. You need to understand any alternative hosts. What other plants do they like and can they attack? So that might help you in selecting a trap crop, for instance. What habitat requirements do they have? What type of damage do they do and how do you identify it? And then what the economic threshold is. So that's comparing the sample count of the pests that you find when you're out scouting to that economic threshold to determine if action is necessary. When you go out and are looking at your farm, just because you see one or two bugs does not mean that you need to spray. You need to understanding that economic threshold tells you at what level is it going to cost me more to not spray than it would be to leave them alone. And then use us at extension to help you determine that level. So in addition to knowing that pest, you need to know what the natural enemies are of that pest. Are there any predators or parasites that are already present in the area that you need to make sure that you're conserving? Are there any beneficials available that you can purchase and release? Ladybugs, for instance. What is their life cycle? What habitat do they like? What are their preferred food sources of nectar, pollen? Prevention and physical barriers can also be a good way to help manage insect pests. So when you're minimizing the niche for pests, we've already mentioned the importance of utilizing crop rotation just to break up that life cycle. We've mentioned some other cultural practices that you can implement, including the use of planting at appropriate dates and times. I do want to really mention here the importance of sanitation. So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about, let's say the season is over, you have a lot of crop residue left over. What are you going to do with that? You don't want to just dump that out back in your field. All that's going to do is provide a great area for that pest to overwinter. They have a safe place to hide and just hang out until next season when they're going to come back out and attack again. So following proper sanitation is really key for insect pests here. And then I also have the option for physical barriers or row covers. This picture that you'll see here are just row covers made of remake cloth or tobacco cloth that are there to help protect. In this instance, it's protecting broccoli from flea beetles. Row covers can be really helpful, especially for the smaller scale grower. Large scale, it's not going to be economically feasible to do this, but for the smaller grower, it would be. You just would need to pay attention to making sure that it's really tight on the edges to keep insects from getting in there. Because if something were to get under there, now they have a protective barrier from other problems. And then of course you have the heat and things underneath the tarping that could just cause them to flourish. So with careful monitoring though, this is an option for insect control that I wanted to point out. Monitoring in an IPM program is absolutely key. For you to understand how to use each components of a plan appropriately, you've got to know what insects are there, how much of them, and what beneficials are there as well. So I mentioned already the use of pheromone traps just to help catch some, to count how many are there. That it can help you with your trap crops. Extension is really here. A lot of times extension will do some of this for you if you're nearby to a research station where they're doing this. So check with them because they'll usually put out reports weekly on certain pests. And biological controls, we've mentioned using conservation tillage as ways to help this flourish. But you're also providing nectar and pollen for existing allies or beneficials, providing overwintering habitat for the good guys, and then a protective habitat from pesticides and tillage for these good guys, the biological beneficials. All right. So some plantings that you can do to around the border of your field to provide good food and habitat for beneficial insects can include plants in the carrot family, like the Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot that you see there on the right. Those in the sunflower family, and then as well as using different legumes, mints, and the buckwheats. It's also important to think about ground cover for those arthropods like spiders and beetles. This can be done through organic mulches, cover crops, and perennial vegetation. The picture is showing some really low-growing clover that can be used in that tomato field. That's really helpful for beetles. I've mentioned parasitic wasps quite a bit, but also ladybugs are really good for us to have in our farm to suppress some of the other pests that we have. I've mentioned the possibility of purchasing some of these biological controls. It's important that you're doing so at the right time, and also taking into consideration, you know, that if it's more of a field type growing situation, it might be a little harder to make sure that they stay. Like I've heard of many instances like where you buy ladybugs, but they kind of just fly away or go somewhere else. That's why most of the research for biologicals is done in greenhouse situations or high tunnels. So what pest controls are allowed in the National Organic Program? Biological materials such as BTs, beneficial nematodes, milky spore, clays, dormant oils, some repellents like garlic, pepper, insecticidal soaps, and botanicals. This list is listed from lower to higher environmental impact. So your biologicals are least disruptive, and then as you move down, it gets more disruptive to the environment. So it's up to you to really choose the least toxic, most selective material that will do the job. Apply it at the correct time. I've mentioned before spraying your trap crops instead of your cash crop. That can be really, really helpful. Spot spray any local infestations that you find. Try to avoid spraying your habitat plantings. And I did want to point out the timing of your spraying is really important when looking out for these beneficials, specifically your pollinators like bumblebees and honeybees. They're going to be out more in the day. So the later in the evening when you're spraying, they're inactive and you are less likely to disrupt their colonies. There are also some programs out there called Bee Watch, I believe, and Field Check, and you can ask me about those later and I'll give you more information on that. But essentially it's where you can get on an app and find beehives near you, specifically honeybee hives that beekeepers have, so that you know when you are spraying that you're able to talk with that beekeeper and keep those so they can go out and either move their hives or cover them with tarping or something to keep those beneficials protected from sprays. And this is not just for synthetic, this is for organic as well. Nematodes or root feeders. These are more common in sandy, low organic soils and can be more troublesome when the soil biological activity is low. Another reason why we really want to encourage that healthy soils. Some examples are cyst, sting, and root rot nematodes. Some ways to control these root feeders would be rotating to non-host crops, controlling those host weeds, and like I said, just having healthy soil with high biodiversity. All right, so we're going to move into managing crop diseases now. Prevention is key here with diseases. Often, once you start noticing symptoms, it's too late really to do anything about it for a lot of diseases. So it's important that we have healthy soil. We are really following strict crop rotation. This is really key for breaking up the cycle of the diseases as well, specifically for crops where the diseases are really persistent in the soil for multiple years, like Phytophthora, for example. Using disease-resistant varieties, following sanitation is also super, super important here. I did want to mention I know it's not a vegetable crop, but when you're doing any type of pruning with fruit trees, it's really important that you follow sanitation here, making sure that you are cleaning and disinfecting your pruners or saw or whatever you're using after each cut, just to help minimize the spread of diseases, particularly fire blight, which can just be devastating for tree fruits like apples or pears. You don't want to handle any wet foliage either, because a lot of times there are different fungal diseases that spread through water. So anytime that you're handling anything while it's wet, you have the potential for that water to move the bacteria or the fungus. Another reason why utilizing drip irrigation can be so much more helpful to you versus overhead, because you're minimizing the splash of those fungal spores that could happen or that might be present. Promoting good air circulation is also key, kind of for the same reason here. Anytime that water lingers, you can increase your risk of having more disease explosion. You want to minimize the opportunity for those diseases to kind of take off and flourish. Also, using protectant sprays as a preventative measure can be a really key management practice here. Because I mentioned at the beginning, often if once you're trying to treat, it's too late. Prevention is really key for disease control. I did mention with sanitation, coal piles, keeping them far away from your fields. This is not only going to help with disease control, but insects as well. And yeah, I think we hit that pretty well. Plant pathogens. I mentioned already fungi. These are going to be more like mold-like growth and worse in wet weather. Some examples are damping off, early blight in tomato. Damping off is one that I have seen quite a bit in transplant production. The other word for that is pythium, and it's often where you'll see the plant, it will be healthy one day and then it just kind of just falls over dead. It's essentially, it looks like the stem and roots just kind of like just shrivel up. Bacteria pathogens are going to be more of a slimy tissue look, and they can actually are going to be spread more through insects. Some examples of these are like bacterial wilt or black rot on brassicas, like cabbage, broccoli, collards, things like that. And then viral pathogens, you will see more of a mosaic discoloration, like the yellow splotching on the plant leaf or the fruit itself. And these are most often insect vectored. So some examples will be tobacco mosaic virus, tomato spotted wilt, things like that. So with disease monitoring, it's important that you are able to, the pathogen. You need to know what type of diseases affect the crop you're growing the most, how they spread, what are the symptoms, and then what conditions favor the disease's growth. If you're a grower who is newer and you're not as familiar with the crop diseases, Virginia Tech has a plant clinic, which is there for you to identify whatever disease problems you have and then provide you with control recommendations. The clinic is currently going through a little bit of a change as far as how they're accepting samples, and they're likely to, and how they charge for those samples. So if you're wanting to use the plant clinic, especially in the next growing season, I recommend that you first contact your extension agent in your county or neighboring county, and they will help you to make sure that that sample is submitted to the lab in the way in which they want it now. But great service that's there to help you identify and treat whatever problems you have going on. So when you're monitoring for diseases, it's important that you scout your field regularly. You need to pay close attention to the weather conditions and disease forecasting models. This is really important for diseases like downy mildew, where they will actually track it across the country, and you can get on and look at a map to see where it's popping up and when it's most likely to hit our area based on the weather. So I can get you links for that, and as I'm reading this, it's reminding me, I'll try to get some of those links posted on our resources website for downy mildew. Some crop protectant materials that are available for you can include copper compounds, elemental sulfur, hydrogen peroxide, potassium bicarbonate, which is effective on powdery mildew, and then some more biological controls. So I did have a note on this slide that most often these protectant materials, especially with organic, are most effective before symptoms appear. You don't want to be trying to play catch up with diseases. You really want to be on top of it before you have any problems. All right, now moving on to weed control. So weeds for organic production, as we mentioned in our last talk, are really the most costly. There's the most labor is involved. Organic does not just replace herbicides with steel. You have to have an integrated strategy where you understand what weeds are there that you're dealing with, you're planning for them, you're preventing them, and you have control methods in place that are going to handle them at the right stage so that they're easiest to control. So I put this slide in here as kind of an ecological understanding of weeds and what their role is in an ecosystem. We don't want them, but essentially they're there and have a purpose, generally to restore soil that has been exposed by disasters like fire, flooding, excessive tillage, or any human-made disturbance. I mean, their role is to kind of come in when other plants won't survive and replenish that ecosystem. Agricultural weeds are those that are adapted to frequently disturbed but fertile soils. So you need to know the weeds that you're dealing with. You need to be able to identify them, understand their life cycle, what triggers their growth, how they affect the crop, and at what point in their life cycle are they the weakest and better able to be controlled. Alex Hessler last week mentioned a lot of really great strategies for managing weeds. So if you missed that, go back and look at his presentation, because he had some really great tips on weed control. But how do you minimize niches for weeds? Minimizing the bare soil in time and space, planting tighter crop rotations. Don't let that soil just be fallow for a long time. You know, you want to outcompete those weeds instead of letting them outcompete you. Mention here buckwheat as a good cover crop, just because it can really take off in a short amount of time. But with cover crops, you do run into some issues with volunteer plants in later years. So you want to look at pros and cons of each one. Choose row spacings that really close canopy gaps quickly. You can use intercropping to overseed, or overseeding to fill any alleys that are there, using mulch between wide spaced crop rows. We talked about some mulching options last week with the tarping, black plastic, etc. And then keep the weeds guessing with crop rotation. This can also, we mentioned, be beneficial for insect and disease control as well. Varying your crop species, planting dates, and then varying your tillage and cultivation methods can also help. Growing really vigorous or competitive crops, really key. choosing varieties that are locally adapted and better suited for the area where you are. Use high quality seed. Give plants a head start by utilizing transplants, maintaining a high soil quality, optimizing that crop nutrition and growing conditions. And key is feeding and watering the crop and not the weeds, especially for binding crops like you see here with the tomato. Drip irrigation is really the way to go because you can have the water and fertilizer applied right there at the root where it's needed without risking getting lots of excessive moisture on the leaves, harboring, which can increase disease pressure and other problems, and as well as you're more conservative with your water when you're doing drip irrigation or trickle. Cover crops, we've mentioned this before a lot, but you're giving the weeds more competition, modifying light environment, and I have allelopathy here. So some cover crops are actually known to kill off some of the other, or make the soil less suitable for weeds to survive based on what they do to the soil, similar to like what you hear of with a walnut tree. So with weed control, the most important thing really is prevention here as well. What can you do to prevent that weed from setting seed? You want to do any of your weed control before it gets to that point. So prevent vegetative propagation by using invasive perennials. You want to draw down the weed seed bank with a stale seed bed and promote weed seed decay. The use of that silage tarping that Alex talked about was a good way to help minimize your seed bank for weed seeds. He also mentioned taking care of the weeds when they were really, really small, because it's easier to kill them, and it's also less injurious to your target crop at that stage too. So just some tools for organic weed control, and that can include the different cultivators that attach to your tractors, flame weeders. We talked a lot about this last week, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Particularly the uses of mulches, both organic and the black plastic. There's also white plastic, which you can use, and it has its own benefits too, as far as heat. So if you have questions about that, I'll be happy to chat with you too. But hit on most of that already. So here's another slide kind of that goes into what you need to do and then how you actually do it. So in order to have annual weeds increase, or if you have annual weeds increase in intensively tilled fields, what you can do to fix that is just reduce your tillage or use mulch. If you have invasive perennial weeds increasing, use tillage targeted at those problem weeds. If you have an issue with summer weeds, you might consider planting cool season vegetables. Cool weather weeds, switch it up to summer vegetables. So these are just some practices to help you adapt your management practices. All right, and lastly, I did want to mention some issues with vertebrate pests, specifically deer. This is probably, they're going to be a cause of the most financial loss for you. But with vertebrate pests, the same as it is for all of the others, you have to know what your enemy is and evaluate what treatment options are right for you, causing the least disturbance to the ecosystem as a whole. There's not really a right answer for control with vertebrate pests. A lot of it's going to come down to how much money you're willing to put in to managing them. The most realistic option for deer control is actually fencing. Often I've seen the use of repellents used, deterrents, both with the concentrates that put off the foul smelling odors like sulfur, like the rotten egg smell, and also the use of like noise cannons and other visual or auditory deterrents. But the deer actually become essentially used to those, and they can lose their effectiveness too if you're not rotating between them the same as you would a chemical for an insect pest. So fencing can be really costly depending on the size of the area which you're needing to put fencing on. So it's really specific for your operation. We've got wildlife specialists at Tech who can kind of help you talk through some of these control options. But if you have anything you've tried that seemed to work well, feel free to share with the group. So with that, I want to try to wrap up so we have a little bit of time for questions. Essentially, integrated pest management and organic are not the same, but they are very they work together in order to accomplish similar goals of having a really healthy ecosystem as a whole for plants and animals alike. It does include the use of chemical controls, but this is more as a last resort instead of just your go-to. So consider the type needed, the target site, and as I mentioned, always read that label and follow directions. Last thing I want to say is an IPM program is only as effective as the person managing it and the time that you put in to making sure that each component is done appropriately.